speak to you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. In 1984, Phyllis Tribble wrote Texts of Terror, literary feminist readings of biblical narratives. For Tribble, the Bible is a book of sad stories, which recounts and therefore propagates the horrors of patriarchal oppression. From the rejection of Hagar, to the rape of Tamar, to the dismemberment of an unknown concubine, to the sacrifice of Jephthah's daughter. Tribble, sadly, makes the Bible a perpetrator of evil. But even in this, she confirms what the Bible says about itself, namely, that the Bible does stuff. As God's word, it will accomplish what God desires and achieve the purpose for which he sent it. If the Bible were just a dusty old book that belongs on a dusty old shelf, it could cause no alarm. But if it does stuff and does stuff to us, we can behold it as a text of terror. I don't tend to think of myself as someone for whom biblical texts hold terror, and you probably don't either. But if I'm honest with myself, there are texts in the Bible that hold at least some degree of discomfort for me, just as I'm sure that there are some texts which make you just a little bit squeamish. Of course they do, because that is part of the work that the Bible does. This may come as some surprise to you, but for me, Ezekiel 33 is near the top of the list. So my sermon today was an opportunity to stare my discomfort square in the face. I can remember when I was in high school, one of my friends from the youth group stood in front of the church on a Sunday night to give testimony. He told us that God had asked him to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ to a man that he was working with. He had refused, and the man had suddenly died. I can still see the anguish on my friend's face as he cried out in agony before us all, "It's too late. It's too late." Ezekiel holds some degree of terror for me because while there have been many times that I have spoken to people about God or warned them about what they were doing, there are also many times, maybe more, in which I felt inclined to do so and yet have refused for whatever reason. Already in grade 3, I can remember feeling compassion for the class nerd. I can still remember the occasion vividly. He was playing alone one day at recess as usual near the wooden playground. I felt the Lord asking me to go and reach out to him and be his friend, and I refused for whatever reason. The good news, of course, is that I can exegete Ezekiel's text, and exegete it quite objectively in such a way as to make sure that I'm nowhere found in it. The easiest way to do this, of course, is to identify the watchman. Just who is this watchman? Well, I've been taught to look at the original context, and here this context is clear. God is addressing the author of the book, Ezekiel, the prophet. And he's, "Son of man," God says to Ezekiel, "I made you a watchman for the house of Israel." So God tells Ezekiel that if he sees the sword coming and does not blow the trumpet to warn the people, and the sword comes and takes the life of one of them, that man will be taken away because of his sin. But God will hold Ezekiel accountable. Here Ezekiel is taking up the figure of the military sentinel. He's called to stand up on the ramparts and survey the land for oncoming armies. This means that, as we see in Matthew 28 and Acts chapter 12, his failure to discharge this military duty is punishable by death. So Ezekiel's on the chopping block, not me. Ezekiel 33, therefore, holds no terror for me. I can enjoy Ezekiel's poetry and study the history and move on with life. What a relief. But of course, Ezekiel isn't the only one in the Old Testament to be assigned the role of watchman. God, we're told in Hosea chapter 9, is a watchman, along with all of his prophets. And Habakkuk climbs the ramparts of the city to survey the land as a watchman. But he isn't looking for armies, he's waiting for the Lord himself. In Isaiah 56, the leaders of Israel are also described as watchmen, though blind ones. I'm genuinely sorry for them, the Israelites, I mean. It's too bad that they were led astray by their leaders, but as Jeremiah observes, even when the watchmen did do their job, the people said, "We will not listen." And the problem is that they themselves were supposed to be something like watchmen, but they failed at the task they were given. For Israel, the prophet Ezekiel tells us, was placed at the center of the nations to be a beacon to the nations, Ezekiel 5:5. And in the words of Exodus 19:6, Israel was to be a kingdom of priests. So the failures of the Jewish nation, well, that's something that Jews have to come to terms with, not me. My mother isn't, as far as we know, Jewish. I'm off the hook. But there is, unfortunately, more to say. The Old Testament text of Ezekiel 33 isn't the only lectionary text placed before us today. When I come to Matthew chapter 18, I find a surprising resonance with Ezekiel chapter 33. Ezekiel's actions were endued by God's word with incredible power. If he spoke truthfully to the dying and they listened, they would be saved. Here in Matthew chapter 18, the same power is manifest. The disciples are to serve as watchmen over God's flock. And their prophetic warnings are able to reconcile people not just to each other, but what they loose on earth will be loosed in heaven somehow. And what they bind on earth will be bound in heaven. This is no small thing. We're also told in an echo of Ezekiel 33 that the one who is warned and does not listen will have to account for their own actions. His blood will be on his own head, or something like that. If he refuses to listen to the church, he must be removed, though hopefully temporarily, from fellowship. It makes sense that those first disciples would be given the same authority as Ezekiel, if only on the basis of genealogy. Ezekiel, a faithful Jew, stands in the gap on behalf of harlot Israel, and so now too, Jesus' disciples. In his 12 disciples, Jesus has chosen new sons of Israel to reconstitute Israel. And as Israel, they pick up the mantle of the prophets as the watchmen of the people. These disciples bring the word of Ezekiel closer to me, chronologically, but they're still 2,000 years away. They don't bring it all the way. There is still an ugly, broad ditch. Lessing's ugly, broad ditch, the linear projection of chronological time, which separates the disciples from me, and God's word to the disciples from me. So I'm still off the hook. But, one more but, there still is a problem. The New Testament presents what we might call a figural view of the church. The new Israel which Jesus reconstitutes around himself is not just the disciples. It's the disciples and their spiritual offspring, those who will, following them, be grafted into Israel, as Romans chapter 11 says. All who follow their teachings are, as Galatians 6 puts it, to be regarded as the Israel of God. The church, then, has been placed as a city on a hill, just as Israel was placed strategically by God in the midst of the nations. The church now bears with Israel and as Israel the mantle of being a kingdom of priests. The mantle of being watchers is now a mantle which the church must share. My brothers and sisters, the Apostle James says, if one of you should wander from the truth and someone should bring that person back, remember this: whoever turns a sinner from the error of their way will save them from death and cover over a multitude of sins. I'm starting to sweat. And it's not just because I'm wearing 4 layers. In the post-apostolic era, church leaders came to see themselves as watchers. They took to heart St. Paul's many injunctions to keep watch. Keep watch, he says, over yourselves and over all the flock which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers. Acts 20:28. Watch out for those who cause divisions and put obstacles in your way. Romans 16:17. Watch yourselves, or you may be tempted. Galatians 6:1. Watch your life and doctrine closely. Preserve in them, because if you do, you will save both yourself and your hearers. 1 Timothy 4:16. Pope Leo, as he writes to his diocesan bishops in the 5th century, reminds them of the enormous responsibility that comes with their appointments. God intended us, he tells them, to be watchmen for the pure body of the church, which we ought to keep clean from every stain. The vocation of the watchman became so important within the Syriac tradition of the early church that it was the basis of a distinct order of celibate women known as the watchers or the wakers. They were, like Ezekiel, to be watchful by summoning Israel back to covenant faithfulness. They were, like the New Testament overseers, to be watchful in how they conducted their lives and in exhorting one another to good works. And they were, like the wakeful virgins in Matthew 25, to be wakeful in keeping vigil for the coming of our Lord. Ephraim the Syrian, one of the greatest poets the church has ever had, wrote most of his hymns for these watchers so that they could lead Syriac congregations in keeping vigil for the resurrected one. The parable of the 10 virgins in Matthew 25 ends with an exhortation. Keep watch, Jesus says, because you do not know the day or the hour. In the next chapter, Matthew 26, Jesus went with his disciples to Gethsemane, and he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee along with him and began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little farther, he fell to his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it's possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." Then he returned to the disciples and found them sleeping. "Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. "Watch and pray so that you do not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went away a second time and then prayed, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away once more and prayed a third time, saying the same thing. Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour is come. The Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners." Notice that the exhortation Jesus gives the disciples to keep watch in the parable of the 10 virgins pops up again in the story of the agony. This suggests to me that it is not an abstract reflection about some distant later days, but it is an imperative that carries some urgency. Keep watch, Jesus says in Matthew 25, and then in Matthew 26 again, keep watch. The hour of temptation is upon us now. And the abject failure of the disciples to obey this command in Matthew 26 is no small thing. It was a failure to fulfill the vocation of the watchman. It was a failure to be true to God and to his word. It was a failure to recognize him in his sufferings, and it was a failure to meet him in his agony and in the cross. Perhaps even it was a failure to welcome the bridegroom in his glory. The disciples' failure to keep watch is a failure to keep watch as Israel. In failing to fulfill their vocation as watchmen, the disciples bear the responsibility of all of Israel's watchmen who failed to perform their duties in the hour of need, just as those who murder Christ are said to be responsible for all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah. This doesn't mean, though, that we have an excuse to point our fingers at Israel. As the 12 pillars of reconstituted Israel, the disciples stand in for both Israel and the church. In Gethsemane, the church failed in its vocation as watchers before it even got off the ground. So we see in the disciples' failure in the garden what St. Paul lays out for us in Romans chapters 1 through 3. Namely that Jew and Gentile are in the same place, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. In the disciples, and in the single action of failing to keep watch, Jew and Gentile take up their place as members of the first Adam, alike under sin and subject to judgment and death. So the whole church is there in Romans chapters 1 and 2, and it is as members of this church that we find ourselves also there at the beginning of Romans, with the whole mass of debauched humanity. No one these days, it seems, wants to be numbered among the perpetrators of Romans 1. But here's the rub. If we refuse to find ourselves there, we will have no basis of finding ourselves in the rest of Romans. In Romans 5:8, for instance, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So it's in finding myself at the beginning of Romans that I can find hope. When I find myself there, I identify with the first Adam, and it's only as a member of the first Adam that I can stake my claim to be a member of the second. It's not the healthy who need the doctor, but the sick. And only those who have fallen asleep on their watch can be woken up. So we have to come clean about the fact that we too have failed to keep watch. But while we slept, there was one who stayed awake through it all. Son of man, God said to him, I've made you a watchman for the people of Israel. And he said, Here I am. It is written about me in the scroll. I have come to do your will, my God. His wakefulness in the face of our wakelessness is the basis of our salvation. Through faith, we believe that we will be judged through the merits and grace of Jesus Christ. And through experience, we know that this grace is with us even now. I tasted it in high school when God gave me a second opportunity to reach out to the boy that I had ignored in grade school. I had the privilege of driving him home from this or that event, and this time I was awake. I joyfully embraced the opportunity to talk to him about his life, about the Bible, and about Christ. So, in the end, we are there with the disciples, sleeping the night away. But the Lord watches over us in our slumber and on our behalf, for he knows how we are formed, and he remembers that we are dust. Yet his greatest mercy is not that he lets us sleep, but that he calls out to us, keep watch, come awake, and participate with me in a life of wakefulness. Wake up, the Apostle Paul says at the end of Romans, for our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. As Ephraim the Syrian puts it in one of his hymns, the wakers rejoice today, for the wakeful one has come to wake us up. On this night, who shall sleep when all creation is awake? Because Adam introduced into the world the sleep of death in sins, the wakeful one came down to wake us up from being submerged in sin. Amen.